At 5:30 in the afternoon on May 27, 1940, the British Army was dying on its feet. The retreat to Dunkirk wasn't an organized withdrawal. It was a slow-motion car crash involving 300,000 men. The roads of northern France were choked with the wreckage of a broken military. Burning trucks, abandoned artillery pieces, and exhausted soldiers shuffled toward the sea like a colony of ants whose hill had been kicked over. The air smelled of burning rubber, sour sweat, and the sickly sweet scent of unburied bodies rotting in the spring heat. The German war machine was tearing chunks out of the rear guard with a ferocity that the world had never seen before. The Blitzkrieg wasn't just an army, it was a mechanical meat grinder. The Panzer tanks rolled over the hedgerows like iron monsters, and the Stuka dive bombers fell out of the sky with a noise that sounded like the earth itself was screaming. To the men of the Manchester Regiment, dug into the mud around the tiny village of Epernay, the war felt over. They were tired, they were dirty, they were terrified. They had been fighting and running for weeks, trading space for time, trying to keep the German wolf pack away from the beaches long enough for the boats to arrive. They were modern soldiers, armed with Lee Enfield rifles and Bren light machine guns, weapons designed by engineers to kill efficiently at range. But against the German armor, their rifles felt like pea shooters. The morale was brittle. The men looked at their officers with hollow eyes, waiting for the order to retreat again, waiting for the inevitable collapse. They felt powerless against the technology that was hunting them down. And then there was Captain Jack Churchill. Walking through the lines of exhausted, mud-caked men, Churchill looked like he had walked off the set of a movie about the Middle Ages. He wasn't carrying a rifle. He wasn't carrying a submachine gun. Slung over his shoulder was a massive piece of yew wood, taller than a man, a medieval longbow. On his hip, where a pistol should have been, hung a basket-hilted broadsword, a heavy blade of Scottish steel that had gone out of fashion 200 years ago. And tucked under his arm were a set of bagpipes. He didn't look worried. He didn't look tired. He marched with a strange, terrifying confidence, inspecting the defenses as if he were preparing for a tournament rather than a desperate last stand against the Wehrmacht. The reaction from the other officers was a mixture of confusion and open mockery. In the mess tents and the hastily dug command posts, they called him Mad Jack. They whispered that the stress of the retreat had finally snapped his mind. They looked at his longbow and laughed. They called it a stick and string. They asked if he planned to hunt rabbits while the panzers rolled over them. To the modern military mind, obsessing over logistics and ballistics, Churchill was a joke. He was an embarrassment. An officer without a modern weapon was improperly dressed, a liability who was bringing a museum piece to a gunfight. They laughed because they were scared, and Churchill's insanity was a convenient distraction from the fact that their modern weapons were failing. But Churchill wasn't crazy. He was calculating. He knew something about war that the manual-thumping officers had forgotten. He knew that technology creates a crutch. Men trust the noise of their guns more than the effect. They spray bullets at shadows because the loud noise makes them feel powerful. Churchill didn't want to feel powerful. He wanted to be lethal. He understood the psychological impact of the bizarre. When a German soldier sees a man with a rifle, he knows what to do. He takes cover. When a German soldier sees a man standing in the open with a sword and a bow, his brain stutters. He pauses. He tries to figure out if he is seeing things. And in that pause, in that split second of confusion, he dies. The weapon Churchill carried wasn't a toy. It was a 100-pound draw-weight war bow. It required the strength of a blacksmith to pull. A modern rifle bullet spins and relies on shock. An arrow doesn't spin. It is a heavy, silent spear tipped with a broadhead, a razor-sharp triangle of steel designed to cut through muscle and arteries like a hot knife through butter. It hits with the force of a sledgehammer, and crucially, it is silent. A rifle shot echoes for a mile, telling every German in the sector exactly where you are. An arrow makes no noise until it strikes. It is the original stealth weapon. Churchill wasn't carrying it for nostalgia. He was carrying it because he planned to kill the enemy before they even knew the battle had started. The village of Epernay was the trap. The road leading into the village was a narrow choke point, flanked by barns and stone walls. It was the perfect spot for an ambush. Churchill positioned his men in the lofts and behind the walls, hiding the Bren guns and the riflemen. He took the most dangerous position himself. He climbed into the loft of a barn that overlooked the main road. He didn't set up a machine gun. He set up his bow. He laid out his arrows on the floorboards, checking the fletching, checking the steel heads. He was preparing to signal the ambush not with a flare or a whistle, but with a piece of medieval violence. The plan was simple, but to his men, it sounded insane. Churchill explained that he would take the first shot. He would kill the German commander. Only when the arrow struck were the men allowed to open fire. The soldiers looked at each other with wide eyes. They were placing their lives in the hands of a man who who intended to start a firefight with a weapon that had been obsolete since the invention of gunpowder. They doubted him. They looked at the heavy German column approaching on the map, half-tracks, trucks, infantry, and then they looked at the bent piece of wood in their captain's hand. They felt like they were part of a suicide pact. The doubt hung in the air, thick and heavy like the smoke from the burning oil refineries in the distance. The waiting was the hardest part. The sun began to dip lower, casting long, bloody shadows across the French countryside. The sound of the German advance grew louder. It started as a low rumble, a vibration in the ground that shook the dust off the barn rafters. Then came the sound of engines, the clanking of tracks, and the shouting of voices. The German patrol was approaching. They were relaxed. They had been chasing the British for days, seeing nothing but the backs of running men. They were arrogant. They were walking down the center of the road, talking, smoking cigarettes, their rifles slung over their shoulders. They believed they were the hunters. They believed the British were broken. Churchill knelt in the darkness of the hayloft, watching through a crack in the wood. He could see them now. A German NCO, a sergeant, was leading the patrol. He was a big man, confident, walking with the swagger of a conqueror. He stopped right in front of the barn to light a cigarette. He was less than 30 yards away. Churchill stood up slowly. He picked up his bow. He selected a broadhead arrow, feeling the cold steel tip against his thumb. He knocked the arrow onto the string. This was the moment of truth. The modern world was outside, a world of engines and explosives. Inside the barn, it was 1940, but Churchill was operating by the rules of Agincourt. He placed his fingers on the string. He began to draw. The wood creaked softly, a sound of immense tension being stored. He pulled the string back to his ear, feeling the massive weight of the bow engaging the muscles of his back. He didn't aim like a rifleman. He aimed by instinct, feeling the line of the arrow, judging the arc. He focused on the German sergeant's chest, specifically the buttons on his tunic. Below him, his men held their breath. They gripped their Bren guns, their knuckles white. They were terrified that the bow would snap, or the arrow would miss, or the German would look up and spray the barn with machine gun fire before the signal could be given. They watched the captain, a silhouette against the dusty light of the loft. They saw the bow bend into a perfect curve. They saw the soldier outside exhale a cloud of smoke, completely unaware that he was standing in the shadow of death. Churchill held the draw. His arm was rock steady. He wasn't shaking. He was perfectly calm. He was about to do something that hadn't been done in European warfare for centuries. He was about to prove that a weapon is only obsolete if the man holding it doesn't know how to use it. The German sergeant laughed at a joke from one of his men. He tilted his head back. Churchill released the string. The sound wasn't a bang. It was a sharp, aggressive hiss that sliced through the stillness of the afternoon. The arrow left the bow at 150 feet per second, a blur of wood and feathers racing across the gap between the Middle Ages and the 20th century. It crossed the 30 yards in a fraction of a second, invisible to the naked eye, a silent messenger bringing the final argument of kings. The flight of the arrow was a ghost in the daylight. It moved faster than a man could blink, crossing the 30 yards of open road in a heartbeat. The German sergeant didn't see it coming. He didn't hear it. 1 second he was exhaling a cloud of cigarette smoke, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, confident that he was the master of the battlefield. The next second, a 3-foot shaft of waxed wood slammed into his chest with the force of a falling brick. The sound wasn't the sharp crack of a gunshot that soldiers are trained to recognize. It was a dull, wet impact, like a butcher slamming a cleaver into a side of beef. The broadhead tip punched through his tunic, smashed through the sternum, and buried itself deep in his lungs. The kinetic energy was so massive that it didn't just wound him. It knocked him backward off his feet, as if he had been shoved by an invisible hand. The sergeant hit the dirt hard. The cigarette flew from his hand, sparking on the cobblestones. He tried to take a breath, but his lungs were pinned shut. He looked down at his chest, his eyes wide with a confusion that was more powerful than the pain. Sticking out of him was a white goose feather fletching. It was an object from a history book, a relic that belonged in a museum case, not on a modern battlefield in France. His brain tried to process the data, but it failed. There was no muzzle flash. There was no smoke. There was just the silence of the afternoon and the sudden, impossible presence of a medieval weapon buried in his body. He died with a look of absolute bewilderment on his face, a man killed by a ghost from the past. The reaction of the German patrol was exactly what Churchill had counted on. Panic is a slow contagion, but confusion is instant. The other soldiers in the squad froze. They stared at their commander lying in the road. They stared at the arrow. They spun around, raising their Mauser rifles, looking for a sniper. But they were looking for the wrong thing. They were scanning the windows and the tree line for the glint of a scope or the puff of smoke that marks a gunman. They weren't looking for a man with a bow in a hayloft. The silence was their enemy, Without the crack of a rifle to give them a direction, they were paralyzed. They shouted at each other, pointing wildly, spinning in circles, exposing their backs to the barn. For 5 seconds, the most disciplined army in the world was turned into a gaggle of frightened tourists. Up in the loft, Churchill didn't waste the moment. He didn't admire the shot. He dropped the bow and drew his sword. The basket-hilted claymore scraped against the scabbard, a harsh, metallic hiss that signaled the end of the stealth phase. He stepped out onto the loading platform of the barn, fully visible, a giant figure looming over the confused Germans. He raised the sword high above his head, the steel catching the last rays of the sun. He didn't use a radio, he didn't use a whistle, he used his voice. He screamed the command signal, a roar that echoed off the stone walls of the village. It was the signal the men of the Manchester Regiment had been waiting for, the signal that the madness was actually a master plan. The ambush was unleashed with the fury of a broken dam. From the windows of the cottages, from the gaps in the stone walls, and from the loft of the barn, the British machine guns opened up. The Bren guns, which the men had been clutching with sweaty hands, hammered into life. The crossfire was brutal. The German patrol, caught in the open road, bunched up in their confusion, was shredded. The bullets chewed up the cobblestones and tore through the unarmored trucks. The windshields shattered. The tires exploded. The Germans who weren't hit in the first volley dove into the ditches, pressing their faces into the mud, trying to escape the sudden storm of lead. Churchill didn't stay in the loft. A commander leads from the front. He ran down the wooden stairs of the barn, the sword still in his hand. He kicked open the side door and sprinted into the street. To the surviving Germans, this must have looked like a hallucination. They were being suppressed by machine gun fire, and running through the smoke was a British officer waving a broadsword, screaming like a banshee. It broke their psychological conditioning. They were trained to fight tanks. They were trained to fight infantry. They were not trained to fight a Highlander charging them with a blade. The terror of the sword was primal. It tapped into a fear much older than gunpowder, the fear of being hacked apart by a piece of sharp metal. One German soldier, a young corporal, popped up from behind the wheel of a truck, raising his M40 submachine gun. He had a clear shot at Churchill, but he hesitated. He stared at the sword. He stared at the man running toward him. In that split second of hesitation, Churchill closed the distance. He didn't swing the sword like a fencer, he swung it like an axe. He brought the flat of the blade down on the German's helmet, ringing it like a bell. The soldier crumpled, knocked cold by the concussive force. Churchill didn't stop. He vaulted over the hood of the truck, landing in the midst of the chaotic melee, shouting orders to his men, directing their fire, a conductor of violence in the middle of the orchestra. The skirmish lasted less than 10 minutes. The German patrol was wiped out. The trucks were burning, sending thick columns of black smoke into the sky. The survivors surrendered, throwing their hands up, terrified that the madman with the sword would decide to take their heads. They were rounded up and pushed against the wall of the barn. They looked at Churchill with a mixture of fear and awe. They whispered to each other, pointing at the bow that was now leaning against the barn wall. They asked the British soldiers if this was a special unit, a secret commando force trained in ancient arts. The British soldiers, who had been laughing at Churchill 2 hours ago, just grinned. They realized that their captain wasn't crazy. He was a genius. He had turned the enemy's confidence into a weapon and used it to cut their throats. But the victory at El Epinete was a small spark in a dark night. The patrol was just the tip of the spear. The main German force was miles behind, but they were coming. The sound of the ambush would draw them in. The smoke would act as a beacon. Churchill knew they couldn't stay. He ordered his men to scavenge what they could: ammunition, food, maps, and prepare to move. He retrieved his arrow from the chest of the dead sergeant. He wiped the blood off on the grass and put it back in his quiver. He checked the edge of his sword. He didn't treat the weapons as trophies. He treated them as tools that had done a good job. The men looked at him differently now. The doubt was gone. They saw that the medieval toy had done something their rifles couldn't do. It had bought them the element of surprise. It had frozen the enemy long enough to kill them. They realized that in a war where everyone is a cog in a machine, the man who acts like an individual is the most dangerous thing on the battlefield. Churchill had given them their pride back. They weren't just a beaten rear guard anymore. They were the men who fought with Mad Jack. They were the men who had seen a German pinned to the earth with a longbow. As the sun set, the ground began to shake again. This wasn't the rumble of trucks. It was a deeper, heavier sound that vibrated in the soles of their boots. It was the sound of tracks, tanks. The panzers were coming. The German command had realized that their patrol had vanished, and they were sending the heavy iron to investigate. Churchill stood in the middle of the road, listening to the approaching storm. He looked at his men. They were tired, but they were ready. He slung the longbow back over his shoulder. He sheathed the sword. He picked up his bagpipes. He didn't order a retreat. He ordered a fighting withdrawal. They would fall back to the next village, the next river, the next wall. They would make the Germans pay for every inch of French soil, and they would do it with a style that the enemy couldn't understand. Churchill knew that the tanks were a problem. A sword can't cut through armor plate. An arrow can't stop a panzer. But he had another trick up his sleeve. He had noticed something about the German tank crews. They fought with their hatches open. They liked the fresh air. They liked to see where they were going. They felt invincible inside their steel boxes. Churchill smiled. It was a cold, predatory smile. He gathered his section leaders. He told them the plan. They weren't going to run from the tanks. They were going to hunt them. He explained that a tank is blind. It is deaf. It relies on the commander sticking his head out of the turret to direct the driver. If you kill the eyes, the beast stops. And Churchill had the perfect weapon to blind the beast. He patted the basket hilt of his sword. The men didn't laugh this time. They nodded. They understood. If the captain said they could kill tanks with courage and daring, they believed him. They moved out into the twilight, slipping into the hedgerows, leaving the burning wreckage of the patrol behind. The air grew colder. The sound of the tanks grew louder, a grinding, metallic roar that filled the valley. The lead panzer came around the bend, its headlights cutting through the gloom. It was a Mark III, a massive slab of gray steel with a 37 cannon. The commander was visible in the cupola, looking through his binoculars. He was scanning the road for mines, scanning for anti-tank guns. He wasn't looking for a man hiding in the bushes with a bag of grenades and a bad attitude. Churchill waited in the ditch. The mud seeped into his uniform. The exhaust fumes from the tank stung his eyes. He watched the treads churning up the earth, crushing the wildflowers. He waited until the tank was almost on top of him. He could smell the oil and the hot metal. He could hear the commander talking on the radio. This was the escalation. The bow had killed a sergeant. Now he had to kill a machine. He tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword. The toy had worked on flesh. Now he would see if the medieval spirit could break steel. The tank rolled forward, blind to the danger that was lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment to strike. The duel between the medieval captain and the modern tank began in the suffocating darkness of a French ditch. To the average soldier in 1940, a panzer was a god of war. It was 30 tons of hardened steel, belching diesel smoke and death. It was immune to rifles. It was immune to machine guns. It moved with a grinding, earth-shaking vibration that turned the bowels of infantrymen into water. To the average infantryman, a panzer was a god of war, immune to rifles, immune to fear. But Churchill didn't see a god. He saw a moving pillbox that was blind, deaf, and terrified of the dark. He knew that a tank was just a moving pillbox, and like all pillboxes, it was blind, deaf, and terrified of the dark. Churchill lay in the wet grass, the basket hilt of his claymore digging into his palm. He watched the Panzer Mark III rumble closer. The machine was terrifying, but it was also clumsy. The driver was peering through a narrow slit of armored glass, his field of view limited to a few degrees of muddy road. The commander had buttoned up the hatch, sealing himself inside the steel womb for protection. That was their mistake. By closing the hatch, they had cut themselves off from the world. They couldn't hear the wind. They couldn't hear the rustle of the bushes. They could only hear the roar of their own engine and the static of their radio. They were powerful, but they were isolated. The tank rolled past Churchill's position, the tracks churning the mud less than 5 feet from his face. The heat radiating from the engine block was intense, smelling of hot oil and exhaust. Churchill didn't flinch. He waited for the beast to pass. His target wasn't the tank itself, it was the infantry following in its wake. German doctrine dictated that tanks never fight alone. They were always supported by a squad of foot soldiers, the eyes and ears of the armor. These men were walking behind the panzer, using its steel bulk as a shield. They were relaxed, believing that the monster in front of them would scare away any resistance. Churchill let the tank pass, then he rose from the ditch like a phantom. He didn't use a gun. A gun flash would have alerted the tank commander, who would have swung the turret around and vaporized the ditch with a high-explosive shell. Instead, Churchill used the sword. He stepped out of the shadows, towering over the rear guard of the infantry squad. The German soldiers were looking forward, watching the backs of their comrades. They didn't see the giant British officer step into their formation. The violence was silent and intimate. Churchill didn't hack wildly. He used the heavy pommel of the sword like a mace. He struck the last man in the line on the back of the helmet. The steel rang with a dull, heavy thud that was swallowed by the noise of the tank engine. The soldier crumpled without a sound. Churchill stepped over him, moving to the next man. It was a dissection of the squad, performed from the rear forward. He moved with a terrifying economy of motion, a predator culling the herd while the shepherd looked the other way. By the time the lead soldiers realized something was wrong, half their squad was on the ground. They turned around, expecting to see a platoon of British regulars. Instead, they saw a single man holding a broadsword, standing over their fallen comrades. The psychological shock was paralyzing. Their brains were wired for modern warfare. They knew how to react to grenades and bullets. They didn't know how to react to a Highlander who looked like he had stepped out of a history book. They hesitated, and in war, hesitation is the only mistake that matters. Churchill didn't give them time to recover. He raised the sword and pointed it at the survivors. He didn't scream this time. He just stood there, a silent, imposing figure in the gloom. The gesture was clear: surrender or die. The German soldiers looked at their rifles, then at the sword, then at the bodies on the ground. The fear of the mad captain broke them. They dropped their weapons. They raised their hands. They had been beaten not by superior firepower, but by superior aggression. But the tank was still moving. It was 50 yards down the road, oblivious to the fact that its tail had just been cut off. Churchill signaled to his men in the hedgerows. This was the second phase of the medieval defense. He couldn't kill the tank with a sword, but he could blind it with fire. He grabbed a satchel of grenades from one of his sergeants. He didn't run at the tank. He ran alongside it, using the hedgerow as cover, matching the speed of the machine. He waited for the tank to reach a crossroads where the ground was uneven. As the Panzer dipped into a rut, the tracks struggled for grip and the engine revved high. Churchill vaulted the hedge. He scrambled up the rear deck of the tank. The metal was slippery with mud and oil. He was riding the dragon. He reached the engine vents. The expert said you needed a shaped charge to disable a tank. Churchill just used gravity. He pulled the pins on 2 grenades and dropped them directly into the intake slats. He rolled off the back of the tank, hitting the dirt and rolling into the ditch. He covered his head. The explosion wasn't a sharp crack. It was a muffled, guttural cough from the belly of the machine. The grenades detonated inside the engine compartment. The diesel fuel ignited. A column of black smoke erupted from the rear of the Panzer. The engine sputtered and died. The beast ground to a halt, its tracks locking up. The crew bilayed out. They threw open the hatches, coughing, eyes streaming from the smoke. They scrambled down the side of the hull, desperate to get away from the burning metal. They landed in the mud, gasping for air. And waiting for them, standing in the middle of the road with his sword resting on his shoulder, was Captain Jack Churchill. The German tankers looked at their burning machine, then at the man who had killed it. They didn't reach for their pistols. They were done. They had been defeated by a man who treated a 30-ton tank like a nuisance rather than a threat. The victory at the crossroads bought the British rearguard another precious hour, but the night was far from over. The German advance was a tide that couldn't be stopped, only delayed. Churchill gathered his men. They were exhausted, their faces gray with fatigue, but their eyes were bright. They had seen the impossible. They had seen a tank destroyed by a man on foot. They had seen an infantry squad taken apart by a sword. The mockery that had surrounded Mad Jack was gone, replaced by a fanatical loyalty. They would follow him into the gates of hell if he asked them to. They moved back to the next defensive line, a small stone bridge over a canal. The retreat to Dunkirk was a game of leapfrog. You hold a position until it's untenable, then you run to the next one, dig in, and do it again. It was a grueling, demoralizing way to fight, but Churchill treated it like a sport. He kept the morale up by refusing to act like a beaten man. He played the bagpipes as they marched. The eerie, mournful wail of the March of the Cameron Men drifted through the fog, a sound that terrified the Germans as much as the arrows. To the enemy, the bagpipes sounded like a ghost army. It made them cautious. It made them slow down. At the bridge, the situation was critical. A company of German infantry was pushing hard, trying to seize the crossing before the British could blow it. The British demolition team was struggling with the wiring under the bridge. They needed time. Churchill looked at the approaching Germans. They were moving tactically, using the cover of the dikes. They were getting close enough to throw grenades at the engineers. Churchill didn't have a machine gun to suppress them. He had his bow. He took up a position behind a stone wall near the bridgehead. He laid out his remaining arrows. The range was longer this time, 60 yards. In the dark, it was a difficult shot, but Churchill didn't need to hit a specific button on a tunic. He just needed to create fear. He waited for the Germans to break cover. A squad leader waved his men forward. Churchill stood up. He drew the heavy yew-bow. He loosed an arrow. It arched through the night sky, invisible and silent. It struck the ground inches from the squad leader's boot, burying itself deep in the turf. The squad leader froze. He looked down at the arrow quivering in the ground. He didn't know where it had come from. He didn't know if it was a sniper or a stray round. He signaled his men to halt. They dropped flat. Churchill fired again. This time he aimed for effect. He put an arrow into the wooden gatepost next to the German position. The solid impact echoed in the night. The Germans were confused. They were taking fire, but there was no report. There was no muzzle flash. They started firing wildly into the darkness, wasting ammunition on shadows. Churchill had achieved his goal. He had pinned down an entire company with a piece of wood and string. He had bought the engineers the 5 minutes they needed. A shout came from under the bridge. "Ready," Churchill yelled for his men to pull back. They sprinted across the bridge, their boots pounding on the cobblestones. Churchill was the last man across. He stopped at the far end, turned, and fired one last arrow into the darkness, a final gesture of defiance. Then he hit the plunger. The bridge erupted. A massive plume of water and stone shot into the sky. The center span collapsed into the canal, cutting off the German advance. The British soldiers cheered. It was a small victory and a massive defeat, but it felt like a triumph. They had stopped the machine. They had survived another night. Churchill walked among them, checking their wounds, offering words of encouragement. He didn't look like a modern officer. He looked like a king from a lost age. His sword was stained. His bow was scratched. But he was alive, and his men were alive. The battle was won, but the campaign was lost. As the sun rose, Churchill didn't retreat. He sat on a dune facing the enemy lines, calmly sharpening his broadheads with a whetstone. The rhythmic sound was the only thing louder than the distant artillery. He sat on a dune, sharpening his broadheads with a whetstone. The scraping sound was rhythmic and calm. A young private approached him. The boy was shaking, his uniform torn, his rifle lost somewhere in the retreat. He looked at the captain, then at the bow. He asked, with a trembling voice, why the captain used such old weapons against such new enemies. Churchill stopped sharpening. He looked at the boy. He didn't give a speech about tactics or silence. He didn't talk about Agincourt. He simply smiled, a wolfish grin that showed all his teeth. "Because," Churchill said, testing the edge of the arrow against his thumb, "any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed, and any man who thinks a gun makes him brave is a fool." He stood up and looked east, back toward the enemy. The Germans were regrouping. They would bring more tanks. They would bring more planes. But Churchill wasn't worried about the odds. He knew that machines could break and ammunition could run out. But the will to fight, the primal, medieval urge to defend your ground with whatever you had in your hand, that was infinite. The toy had proven its worth. It had stripped the war down to its essence. It wasn't about the technology. It was about the man holding the weapon. And as long as Jack Churchill was breathing, the Germans would never be safe from the past. The retreat continued. The boats were coming. But the legend of the Archer of Epinette was already being written. The Germans would talk about him in their mess halls. They would whisper about the British demon who hunted tanks with a sword. They would laugh nervously, trying to convince themselves it was just a story. But the men of the Manchester Regiment knew the truth. They had seen the arrow fly. They had heard the silence. And they knew that when the history books were written, they would say that while the rest of the world was fighting World War II, Mad Jack Churchill was fighting his own personal crusade, and he was winning. The walk to the beaches of Dunkirk was a descent into a mechanical hell. The roads were no longer roads. They were graveyards for the British Expeditionary Force. Burning trucks clogged the ditches. Their tires melted into black puddles on the asphalt. Abandoned artillery pieces pointed their barrels at the sky, useless monuments to a retreat that had moved too fast for heavy metal. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, cordite, and fear. Through this chaotic river of broken men walked Captain Jack Churchill, a figure who seemed to have stepped out of a different century. He marched with a steady, rhythmic gait, his longbow slung over one shoulder, his basket-hilted sword swinging at his hip, and his bagpipes tucked under his arm. He didn't look like a refugee fleeing a disaster. He looked like a king returning from a hunt, annoyed that the game had been interrupted. When the remnants of the Manchester Regiment finally breached the dunes and saw the sea, the scale of the disaster hit them. The beaches were black with men. 300,000 soldiers were standing in lines that stretched into the water, waiting for boats that were too few and too small. The German Luftwaffe was hammering the sands, dropping bombs that threw geysers of wet sand and shrapnel into the waiting crowds. It was a place of absolute industrial despair, but when the men on the beach saw Churchill arrive, the mood shifted. They pointed, they nudged each other. The rumor of the mad archer had beaten him to the coast. They saw the German helmet hanging from his belt, a trophy taken not with a bullet, but with a blade. They saw the fletching of the arrows in his quiver. The officers who had mocked him back in the mess hall, the ones who had laughed at his sticks and string, didn't laugh now. They looked at their own empty holsters and abandoned vehicles, and then they looked at the man who had brought his weapons with him. They realized that while they had relied on a supply chain that had collapsed, Churchill had relied on physics and muscle. His weapon didn't need a factory to produce ammunition. It just needed a piece of wood and a steady hand. He had proven that independence was the ultimate weapon. Churchill didn't stop fighting just because he reached the water. He spent his time on the beach organizing defenses, playing his bagpipes to drown out the scream of the Stuka dive bombers. When he finally boarded a small boat back to England, he didn't look back with sadness. He looked back with calculation. The campaign in France was over, but the war was just starting, and he knew exactly how he was going to fight it. He wasn't going to change. He wasn't going to trade his sword for a desk job. He was going to double down. The legend of Mad Jack didn't end at Dunkirk, it exploded. Over the next 5 years, Churchill became the spirit animal of the British Commandos. He led raids in Norway, Italy, and Yugoslavia, always with the sword, always with the pipes. In Italy, he captured 42 German soldiers in a single night using only his sword and a shout, terrifying them into surrender because they thought they were being attacked by a demon. He proved time and again that the medieval toy was not a gimmick, it was a symbol of aggression. In a war of faceless machines and long-range artillery, Churchill forced the enemy to look him in the eye. He forced them to deal with a man, not a system. The war finally caught up with him in Yugoslavia, but even then it couldn't break him. He was knocked unconscious by a grenade while playing "Will You No Come Back Again" on his pipes. The Germans captured him. They thought they had caught a lunatic. They sent him to the concentration camp at Sachsenhausen. But you can't cage a man who thinks he's Robin Hood. Churchill escaped. He walked 100 miles across the Alps to find the American lines. When the war in Europe ended, he was disappointed. He famously complained that if it hadn't been for the Americans, the British could have kept the war going for another 10 years. He wasn't tired of the fighting, he was just getting started. After the war, the man who had hunted tanks with a bow and arrow didn't fade into a gray, civilian existence. He treated peace with the same eccentric intensity as war. He became a passionate surfer, riding the tidal bore of the River Severn on a homemade board. He continued to play the bagpipes, shocking the quiet English countryside with the noise of battle. He worked a desk job for a while, but he refused to let the boredom claim him. Every day on his train ride home, he would stand up as the train passed his backyard and throw his briefcase out the window. The other passengers thought he had finally lost his mind. They didn't know that he was just saving himself the trouble of carrying it home from the station. He was tossing it into his own garden. It was a small act of rebellion, a refusal to do things the normal way just because everyone else did. Churchill died in 1996 at the age of 89. He passed away peacefully in Surrey, a quiet end for the loudest soldier in the British Empire. His sword and his bow were retired, but the lesson he taught the world remained sharp. Historians and military experts spent decades analyzing the Second World War. They wrote books about the Tiger tanks, the Spitfires, and the atomic bomb. But amidst all the analysis of horsepower and tonnage, the story of the man with the longbow kept resurfacing. It wouldn't go away. It stood out like a splash of red paint on a black and white photograph. Historians have spent decades analyzing the Tiger tanks and Spitfires of World War II. But amidst all that horsepower, Jack Churchill remains the splash of red paint on a black and white photograph. He didn't just kill a sergeant with a longbow, he killed the idea that technology is a substitute for courage. He proved that when the world tells you your methods are obsolete, you don't give up. You tighten your grip on your sword and you charge. If this story moved you, if you believe that the spirit of the mad captain deserves to be remembered in a world of push-button warfare, do me a favor. Hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that these stories matter. It helps us find more legends like Jack, more stories of the men who walked into the fire with a smile and a sword. And if you haven't subscribed yet, join the community. We are rescuing these stories every single week, ensuring that men like Churchill don't disappear into silence. Drop a comment below and tell us. Would you have marched with Mad Jack, or would you have thought he was crazy? Do you think there is still a place for the warrior spirit in modern war, or has technology taken over completely? We read every single comment. We want to hear your voice. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. We'll see you in the next video.